Thank you so much. You have a seat. Thank you so much, Guy. Quite interesting presentation, but you talked a lot about the developing world. You know, you talked about the UK and Europe and the US, but this is a different market. This is a different reality. You talk about the US, where the unemployment rate is around 3.9%, the lowest in almost 50 years. You talk about Europe, where the unemployment rate is very low, even lower than before the crisis at the beginning of the century. Of course, it varies, but it changes a lot from country to country. In your country is around 4%, but you have some Eastern European countries with just 2% of unemployment rate. Here we have around 10% of unemployment. And the ones that have a job, at least 50% are part of the informal economy. How can companies like Uber help us to move those workers from the informal economy to the formal economy?
I think that's a really good question. And you're right, most of my examples were from US, Europe, and but Uber is in 60 countries around the world. We are across Latin America, we're across Africa, Middle East, and we do have experience working in these countries. I think one thing that strikes me is how, if you compare Uber to what came before, if you think about often the taxi market, or even actually informal cars you would find in South Africa and Egypt, you'd get in a car without anything. Now every transaction is tracked, it's all digital. The payments are largely digital. And so what that means is you're taking something that used to be a cash business, that used to be like paper receipts, if you got a receipt at all, and bringing it into a formal economy. You're seeing drivers open bank accounts in order to get their income. They have to have a smartphone, they have to have email addresses, they have to come into what is largely the formal economy. And definitions of formality vary around the world. But as I said, we want to work with tax authorities, with governments around the world, in order to help people meet their obligations. And so I think there is a story there about how we can use technology to help with boosting formality.
I am one of the heaviest Uber users in the whole world. And I talk to the drivers quite often. And it also changes from country to country, but they complain a lot. Some of them, you know, like 50% of them complain. The first complaint they have is that there is too much competition, too many drivers. And so having too many drivers in the market forces them to work long hours. How can you regulate that in the sake of safety for the passenger and for the driver?
So I think where I'd start would be to say Uber is an open marketplace. We believe in access. That was one of our first principles. So we think if you meet the criteria, which are either set by us or by regulation, you should be able to sign up to Uber and drive and earn money. And that's really important, for particularly if you lose your job, if you have an unexpected bill, you need the money. The ability to start working with low barriers to entry is really important. What that means is that people can come and go as they please. You're not locked into Uber. You do get new drivers entering. On the point about safety, we have actually now introduced, I'm not sure in Colombia, but I know in many countries around the world, hour limits. So there is a cap to how many hours you can do in one go before you have to take a mandatory break off the platform. I'm looking at my colleague from Uber Colombia to see if he's I can confirm whether we have it in Colombia, but I can follow up afterwards. But we definitely are taking that seriously, because drowsy driving is a risk. You don't want people on the road for a long period of time without taking breaks. So we definitely are using technology to stop people from driving excessive amounts of time.
So you operate in many cities in the world, more than 20 countries. So you have to operate with different regulatory environments. You have to cope perhaps with, hundreds, because every city has their own regulatory framework. Among the ones you know, which one is a good balance? Which one is a good way that really benefits the driver, benefits the passenger, benefits society?
I think over time we've realized there's no one model. At first, when Uber launched, it had a very aggressive strategy of we have the answer, we're going to go in and we're going to do whatever we like. I think we've realized over time that there are many different models in which Uber can work. So in Finland and the Netherlands, Uber is taxi. You have the drivers all have taxi licenses, they're regulated like taxi, and that works, and that's fine. In the UK, there's a category called private hire. It's a sort of pre-booked, it's often called rental car in other countries, and that works. In the US, there is sort of ride sharing, where we're regulated as a transportation network company, and you or I, with our private car, as long as we meet the background check and have a sort of clean driving history, can start driving tomorrow and earning money. And I think the one thing I'll say is that there is a relationship between how hard it is to get going as a driver and how you use the app. So we see in London, where I'm from originally, the median driver spends 30 hours a week logged into Uber. In the US, where it's much easier to get going, you don't have to go through as arduous a process. The median driver spends 10 hours a week on Uber.
But who defines those rules, Uber or the government?
The government.
The government.
So there is a myth that Uber doesn't like regulation and doesn't want to be regulated. We want to be regulated. The problem is oftentimes regulations were written at a time when the smartphone didn't even exist, when this wasn't contemplated, and so many countries needed to create and update those regulations.
Do you know any country where drivers have to contribute to the social security system when they work for Uber?
Absolutely. So I think in most countries, if you're self-employed, you have obligations to pay your taxes and to contribute. So in the UK, which I know perhaps best, drivers are self-employed. They file a tax return each year. They have to pay social security contributions. Similarly in France, similarly in the US. I don't know the Latin American countries as well, but my understanding is that there is a similar obligation, at least on the individual, to do that here.
Great. So let me open the floor for questions. Any questions in the audience? Aquí, por favor, el micrófono adelante al señor experto en el dark web. Si tienen un micrófono, por favor. Está la plataforma también, ¿no? Está la plataforma, si tienen... Pero tomamos esta y por favor las preguntas en la plataforma, sí, perdón que no la ve, yo que estoy pendiente de las tecnologías, si no...
Gracias. Doctor Molano, muchas gracias. Yo soy uno de los congresistas más jóvenes del país. Tengo 27 años y yo crecí con este tipo de tecnologías. Entonces, créame que este cuento, incluso de la dark web, ni me asusta, ni me espanta, ni me sorprende. Es uno de los mecanismos más eficientes para compartir información de manera segura, por ejemplo. No solamente la parte ilegal, que para muchos es como la más importante. Mr. Levin, I'm one of the youngest congressmen here in my country. I'm 27 years old. My name is Joseph. I would like to ask you something about the structure from Uber in Colombia. Here we are under these rules and laws that contribute to an order in the transport industry. For example, a cab costs around $20,000 more to $50,000 more than a regular car because you gotta buy a spot in a public transportation industry, all right? You gotta pay for your spot in order to transport people. But Uber drivers doesn't have to do that. That's sad because that gives an advantage to driver users and drivers against the cab drivers. For example, you talk about in other countries that in order to be a Uber driver, you have to be a cab driver or have a license, all right? But here in Colombia, you don't need the license. You need the spot that you have to buy from a firm like, I don't know, Tax La Feria or something like that. how can you tell us, or how can we as legislators give balance in this thing? Because, all right, the message we're sending when we tell people Uber is right is that you don't have to get your spot, so you just have to buy a car, and you don't need to get regularized, so you just need to get an app. And what Uber is doing in Colombia, it's harming more than 400,000 drivers that live from the cab driving industry. What can we do to get the balance inside this mess that we have right now as legislators?
Okay.
Great. I think that's a really good question. It's a fair question of like, what do you do about the incumbent industry? How do you regulate in a way that's fair to all? I'm with you. I think the answer has to be that you want to have a level playing field. You want to balance things. And so what we saw in Finland, for example, was they basically lowered the barriers for taxi. As in, we think it should be. We think it's kind of absurd that it is so hard for a taxi. In London, where I'm from, to become a taxi driver is nigh on impossible. And that creates huge barriers to entry, particularly where it's a spot that you have to buy if it's a medallion. I think that harms consumers. It's anti-competitive, it drives up prices, it reduces the service quality. And so what you saw actually in New York, where the city wanted to place a cap and just did place a cap on the number of Ubers, was that it was the civil rights leaders, it was the black community in the outer boroughs who was our most vocal supporter and critic of the government's plans to put in the cap, because they knew that the service quality and the area that was covered by Uber is places where cabs don't go. Cabs go to the city centre, they go to the rich areas, they don't go to the poor areas, they don't go to the places where there isn't the public transport and where people actually need the transportation. And so I think like what we've seen around the world is Uber can expand coverage, it can expand the service quality for riders, while at the same time providing that economic opportunity for the drivers by allowing easy access. That said, you're right, we should be looking at how do you regulate that? How do you make sure it's fair across both? How is there a balance between the two? So in some cities, so in Mexico, I understand it, there is a levy on each Uber trip, which goes in part at least towards funding taxi. In Australia, there's something similar. Like we don't necessarily love those answers, but there are ways of trying to balance the market so that it's fair to everybody.
There is a question from the app. How to help the independent worker, the independent worker understand the benefits of contributing to the social security system with Uber?
So I don't know enough about the Colombian, what the set of benefits that you get at the end of it are, but like in most places in the world, it's a legal obligation. You are required to contribute, and that it's not for like you to choose if you do or not. I know there are issues with compliance, and like we should use technology to help people make it super easy to know what you owe and to pay what you owe. Like we are looking at things. So in the US, we had an example with a partnership with a fintech, a sort of Betterment, who are sort of online savings and retirement company, to make it really easy and cheap for drivers to save for their retirement. And there we were sort of marketing it to drivers. Look, I think it's something for all of us to think about on how do you improve financial education across the board? How do you ensure that it's easy to comply with your obligations and that the benefits are there at the end? I don't think we have the answer to all of that, but want to use our technology to help.
¿Tenemos alguna otra pregunta por la app?
Gracias. Muy buenos días. Good morning. A quick question to Guy. Which country has been the most difficult to Uber to achieve a legit normalized operation, and which the easiest or the fastest? Thank you.
It's a tricky one. So there have been countries where Uber has gone in and had to leave because there wasn't either an existing regulatory structure that we could fit in, or the willingness to consider reform. I know Spain is a really tough example for us, that there is a law that says that for every 30 taxis there can be. So in Spain we're regulated. We have VTC, which is a pre-booked private hire. But there's a law that says for every 30 taxis, there can be one VTC. And I understand the politics of why that is difficult to reform, but from the consumer perspective or from the driver perspective, it's absurd. There is no legitimate rationale for that, other than to protect an incumbent industry. It's anti-competitive. So that's been a tricky place for us. We still operate and are licensed as VTC. In terms of easier places, I think Mexico was actually one of the first countries to pass a lot of laws regulating Uber and creating this new category to regulate Uber. So that was one of the easier countries, I'd say. But as I said, look, we want to be regulated. There are many models that regulation can take. I don't know the specifics for Colombia, but I know my colleagues are working hard with government officials to try and find that. In Argentina, for example, I know it's also been very tough, but actually the city of Mendoza recently passed a law to regulate Uber, and that was a great step forward, because there is this opportunity from providing this form of work for the drivers, but also for the riders, so expanding that service area, getting transportation to people who need it at a cheaper cost.
Bueno, pues realmente interesante. Ven como a mí la frase que me llevo es que la gente cree que Uber no quiere ser regulado, pero Uber dice que sí le gusta ser regulado. Pues nos quedamos sin tiempo, pero Guy va a estar aquí con nosotros hoy todo el día. Lo pueden buscar para preguntarle, o también a nuestro congresista José sobre el dark web, experto en el tema. Y pues muchísimas gracias a todos. Demos un gran aplauso a Guy por su presentación. Muchas gracias.
Muchísimas gracias.